The dust along the trail clung to Clara's skirts as she guided the old wagon closer to the wide wooden gates of the steel ranch. Her hands, still calloused from months of managing what little she had left after her husband's passing, tightened on the reins as she took in the vast property that stretched out before her. It was a world so different from the one she'd left behind, a world of wealth, order, and quiet strength. The ranch house stood tall against the backdrop of endless prairie, its white-painted trim and deep porch suggesting both prosperity and discipline. Cattle dotted the distant fields, and ranch hands moved with steady purpose, their voices carrying faintly on the warm afternoon breeze. Clara's chest tightened. She was not a stranger to hard work, but she wondered if she belonged in a place so grand, so established, while she carried the weight of her widowhood and the uncertainty of her future. When her husband had died suddenly, the winter before, Clara had been left with little more than grief and unpaid debts. She had taken on sewing, mending, and occasional washing for neighbors, but the meager coins she earned could not support her for long. So when she heard through a church friend that Jacob Steele, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the county, was seeking a cook, she swallowed her pride and answered the notice. Cooking was something she could do well, something that gave her a sense of usefulness, even joy, despite her loss. As she pulled the wagon to a stop near the corral, Clara smoothed her skirt and adjusted her bonnet, gathering her composure before stepping down. A ranch hand approached, tipping his hat politely. "You must be Mrs. Clara Whitfield," he said. His tone carried a mix of curiosity and respect, as though he had heard of her but was still measuring her place in this new setting. "Yes," she replied softly, her voice betraying both nerves and determination. "I've come about the cooking position." He nodded and offered to take the reins, gesturing toward the main house. "Mr. Steele's expecting you." Clara's heartbeat quickened as she climbed the porch steps. The door opened before she could knock, and there stood Jacob Steele himself. He was taller than she imagined, his frame broad from years of labor and his presence commanding. His dark hair was touched with the sun, and though his face bore the marks of weather and responsibility, his eyes were sharp, watchful, cautious. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice deep, steady. "You've made the trip. Come in." Inside, the house was large but strangely quiet. The polished wood floors gleamed, and the parlor was neatly kept, though it felt more like a place of business than a home filled with warmth. Clara noticed the absence of laughter, of life, the kind she had known in her own small but lively cottage before sorrow had silenced it. Jacob led her to the kitchen, where the stove sat unused, the cupboards tidy but barren of home-cooked scents. Clara could see at once why he had posted the notice. This was a house of order, but not of comfort. It needed the heart of a woman's touch, though she dared not say it aloud. Jacob studied her a long moment, as if weighing her strength and sincerity. "It's honest work," he said simply. "Meals for the household, sometimes the hands. It'll be long days." Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. "I'm no stranger to long days, Mr. Steele. I came because I believe I can be of service." There was silence for a beat, broken only by the creak of the house in the afternoon heat. Then Jacob gave a brief nod. "We'll see." Clara exhaled slowly. The journey that had begun with grief and desperation now unfolded before her as something new. Uncertain, yes, but filled with possibility. She had stepped across the threshold not just of the Steele Ranch, but of a new chapter in her life, unaware of the little girl upstairs who would soon tug at her heart in ways no employment ever could. The next morning, Clara rose early, just as she had in the days when her own household had still been full of life. She had unpacked her few belongings the night before in a modest room set aside for her near the back of the house. Plain but comfortable. The quilt on the bed was worn, yet she was grateful to have a place to lay her head that did not belong to charity or the kindness of neighbors. She washed quickly, tied her hair in a neat knot, and stepped into the quiet halls. The house carried a solemn stillness, as if everyone within its walls spoke in low tones or withheld words altogether. Even the grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a measured restraint. Clara was reminded of walking through a church on a weekday, sacred, orderly, but empty. She made her way to the kitchen, eager to begin. Though the cupboards had been tidy, they lacked much of what a proper household might use. She rolled up her sleeves and began assessing what she had to work with. A bag of flour, some dried beans, a slab of salted pork, and a few eggs sat waiting. With practiced hands, she set about making biscuits and frying the pork, the aromas, slowly breaking the silence of the house. It wasn't long before Jacob Steele appeared in the doorway. He looked freshly washed, his hair still damp, his shirt neatly tucked into his trousers. He carried himself with a kind of authority that didn't need to be spoken. It was in the way he stood, the steadiness of his gaze, the very air around him. "You're up early," he remarked, his tone not unfriendly but measured. "A cook's work begins before the sun, Mr. Steele," Clara replied, placing the biscuits into the oven. "I thought it best to give the house a proper breakfast." He nodded slightly, crossing his arms as though appraising not just the meal but the woman preparing it. She could sense the weight of his caution. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, she thought. Perhaps life had made him that way. As the biscuits baked, Clara set the table. She placed the fried pork, scrambled eggs, and a small jar of preserves she had brought along from her own pantry. It wasn't much, but it looked like a breakfast worthy of beginning the day with strength. Jacob sat down, but Clara noticed he ate with the efficiency of a man who viewed food as a necessity, not a pleasure. Each bite was measured, his eyes flicking occasionally to her, as though still deciding if she would last longer than the others who had likely come before her. "You said you were a widow," he began carefully. "Yes," Clara said softly, her hands busying themselves with wiping the counter. "My husband Samuel passed last winter. Fever took him quickly." Jacob inclined his head slightly, his face betraying little, though she thought she glimpsed a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she whispered, and for a moment silence settled between them. Before either could speak further, a small sound broke the stillness, a creak on the stairs. Clara turned to see a little girl lingering halfway down the staircase. Her hair was dark like her father's, her dress neat but simple, and her eyes wide with curiosity. "Emma," Jacob said, his voice softening in a way Clara hadn't yet heard. "Come sit." The girl hesitated before descending the stairs and slipping into a chair at the table. She stared at the biscuits, then at Clara, her little brow furrowed in thought. Clara offered her a gentle smile. "Good morning, Miss Emma," Clara said warmly. "I've made biscuits. Would you like one with jam?" Emma's eyes shifted to her father as though seeking permission, then back to Clara. Without a word, she nodded. Clara placed a biscuit on a plate, added a dollop of jam, and slid it in front of her. The child picked it up carefully, taking a small bite. Slowly, her face brightened and she chewed with quiet delight. Clara felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. It was not just the satisfaction of cooking a good meal, it was the look in the little girl's eyes, the silent way she seemed to be searching for something more than food. Jacob noticed, too, though he said nothing. He only sat back in his chair, studying both his daughter and the new cook, as though weighing the subtle shift that had already begun in his household. And for Clara, the first impression was clear. This was not merely a house in need of a cook. This was a home aching for warmth and perhaps a little love. Clara had sensed it from the first morning, the watchful presence of a child who lingered quietly in the background, neither entirely withdrawn nor fully willing to step into the light. That afternoon, while the ranch hands were out working, the cattle and Jacob was gone to oversee business in town, Clara found herself alone in the house with little Emma. She had just finished kneading bread dough, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a light dusting of flour across her hands, when she caught sight of Emma peeking around the doorway. The girl stood half-hidden, her small fingers clutching the wood as though she were afraid the moment she stepped inside, she might be turned away. Clara smiled softly, brushing flour from her hands onto her apron. "You've been watching me a while, haven't you?" she asked gently, careful not to startle her. Emma's eyes widened, but she nodded. She was perhaps 6, maybe 7. But her gaze held an oldness beyond her years, the kind that came from missing something essential, something a child should never have to go without. "Would you like to come closer?" Clara invited, motioning toward the dough. "I could use an extra pair of hands." The girl hesitated, glancing toward the stairs, then back at Clara. "Papa says I'm not to be in the kitchen," she whispered, her voice soft but clear. Clara's smile deepened. "Well, if Papa ever asks, you can tell him you were helping me with important work." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Bread dough doesn't rise properly without a little bit of magic, and children are the best at it." Emma's lips twitched, the beginnings of a smile breaking through. Slowly she padded into the kitchen, her small feet barely making a sound on the polished floor. Clara guided her to the table and placed a small lump of dough in front of her. "Now," Clara said, demonstrating with her own piece, "you push it down like this, then fold it over and then push again." Emma mimicked her, her tiny hands sinking into the soft dough. A giggle escaped her lips, quiet at first, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed, then freer, brighter, like a bell ringing after long silence. Clara's heart warmed at the sound. "You're very good at this," Clara praised. Emma's cheeks flushed pink, and she looked up shyly. "Mama used to make bread," she said softly. The words seemed to slip out unguarded, and for a moment, her hands stilled on the dough. Clara felt a tug deep within her chest. She knew what loss looked like. It was written plainly in the child's eyes. Without pressing, she nodded gently. "I imagine she taught you well," she said, keeping her tone steady, comforting. Emma gave the smallest nod, then busied herself with kneading again. Clara let the moment be, offering her the simple solace of shared work and quiet companionship. When the dough was ready, they placed it carefully in the pan and set it near the stove to rise. Clara washed their hands in the basin, drying Emma's, with a soft towel. "Now," Clara said with a playful grin, "we wait. Bread dough likes to take its time." Emma tilted her head, a mischievous sparkle in her eye. "Like Papa," she whispered, and then giggled again. Clara laughed, surprised by the child's wit. "Yes, perhaps a little like Papa." It was in that small moment of laughter, of trust, that Clara realized the girl was reaching for her in ways she hadn't expected. She wasn't merely curious about the cook. She was searching for warmth, for presence, for the gentle hand and kind word she had been missing. Later, when Jacob returned, he found Emma sitting at the kitchen table, watching the bread rise with eager eyes while Clara prepared supper. The air was lighter somehow, as if Emma's quiet giggle still lingered in the room. Jacob paused in the doorway, his gaze shifting between his daughter and the widow at the stove. Something unspoken passed between him and Clara then. A silent acknowledgement that she had touched a place in Emma's heart he himself could not reach. Clara, sensing his watchfulness, kept her focus on the bread. But deep down, she knew. This was only the beginning. The next days fell into a rhythm Clara had long missed. Rising before the sun, she stoked the stove to life, the gentle crackle of kindling giving way to the steady warmth of fire. Soon, the kitchen, once hollow and lifeless, became the heart of the house. The air filled with the aroma of fresh bread, simmering stews, and pies cooling on the windowsill. Where there had been silence, now there was the hum of a home alive, again. Clara moved with practiced ease, her hands remembering each recipe as though she were stitching her own memories into the meals. She used what little she had, stretching ingredients with creativity and care, and in time, the pantry felt less like a storehouse and more like a canvas for her craft. It wasn't just the food, it was the feeling. She hummed softly as she worked, tunes her husband had once teased her for, songs that had comforted her through hard days. At first, she hummed only for herself. But before long, she noticed Emma lingering in the doorway again, her small face alight with quiet wonder at the warmth that seemed to spread from the kitchen outward. "Would you like to help me peel these apples?" Clara asked one morning, setting a small paring knife aside. Emma's eyes widened, as though she'd been caught hoping for just such an invitation. She scurried over, sliding into the chair beside Clara. Her hands fumbled at first, the peel breaking unevenly. But Clara didn't mind. She guided her gently, patient, with each clumsy slip. "That's perfect," Clara assured her, though Emma's apple looked more like a half-chewed cob than a peeled fruit. Emma giggled at the sight of it, and Clara joined her, the sound of their laughter spilling into the hallway. It wasn't long before Emma grew bolder. She asked questions about recipes, about why bread needed yeast, about why Clara sometimes tapped the pie crust to listen for its readiness. Clara answered each, one never dismissing her curiosity. Slowly, the girl's shy reserve began to crack, replaced by the natural chatter of a child who felt safe enough to speak. At supper, Jacob noticed the change. Instead of sitting in silence, Emma spoke of what she had helped with that day, how she stirred the stew, or how she thought her apple pie slice was the ugliest but best-tasting piece. Jacob listened, his brow furrowed not in disapproval but in something closer to surprise. He hadn't heard his daughter chatter so freely in months, maybe years. "You've been busy," Jacob remarked one evening, glancing at Emma, then at Clara. His voice carried an edge of something unsaid. Was it gratitude or caution? Clara couldn't tell. Emma, oblivious to the weight of her father's tone, nodded eagerly. "Miss Clara says food tastes better if you smile while you cook it." She beamed at her father, then took another bite of her bread. Jacob's lips curved faintly, the closest thing to a smile Clara had seen on him yet. "Is that so?" he asked, eyes flicking to Clara. She lowered her gaze modestly, hiding the warmth in her cheeks. "It's just something I tell her to make the work more fun," she murmured. But the truth was, she believed it. Food carried the heart of the one who made it, and in her small way, she was pouring her heart into each dish, not just for wages, but because she could see how much this household needed it. As days turned into weeks, the kitchen transformed. It wasn't just a place of cooking. It was a sanctuary where Emma's laughter rang, where Jacob paused longer than necessary in the doorway, where Clara herself felt a piece of her broken heart slowly mending. And though Clara would never have admitted it aloud, she had begun to think of the kitchen not as his kitchen, but as their kitchen, theirs to share, to build memories in, to warm a house that had grown too cold. It was here, amidst the scent of rising bread and simmering stew, that the first fragile threads of family began to weave themselves together. By the second week, Clara realized Emma's silence had given way to questions. At first, they came in cautious whispers, slipped in while Clara stirred a pot or rolled out dough. But soon, Emma's curiosity spilled forth in earnest, as though a dam inside her had broken, releasing all the thoughts she had stored away. One afternoon, as Clara shelled peas on the porch, Emma crept beside her with a small wooden stool, dragging it across the boards with a squeak. She climbed onto it and sat with her knees pulled up, watching Clara's hands. "Why do you always hum when you work?" Emma asked suddenly. Clara smiled faintly, glancing at her. "Because it keeps the work from feeling like work. And because the songs remind me of good things." Emma tilted her head. "Like what?" Clara hesitated, her fingers pausing over the bowl of peas. Memories of her late husband flooded her. His laugh, the way he teased her about humming while mending clothes or baking bread. For a moment, the ache of loss tightened her chest, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Like evenings in my old kitchen, when my husband would sit by the fire and tell me stories while I cooked. He always liked it when I hummed." Emma's eyes widened. "You had a husband?" "Yes," Clara said softly. "His name was Samuel. He was very kind." The little girl studied her with solemn curiosity. "Where is he now?" Clara took a slow breath, setting aside the empty pea pods. "He passed away last winter. The fever came quickly, and the Lord called him home." Emma grew quiet, her small fingers fiddling with the hem of her dress. "I don't have a mama," she whispered after a long pause. "Papa says she's in heaven too." Clara's heart twisted at the innocence of the words. She placed a gentle hand over Emma's. "Then, we both know what it feels like to miss someone very much." The girl nodded, her throat bobbing as she swallowed. Then, after a moment, her curiosity returned like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Did you and your husband ever have children?" Clara's smile faltered, but she kept her voice tender. "No, Emma. The Lord didn't bless us that way, but I always thought I'd like to." Emma considered this with the seriousness of a judge, then leaned a little closer. "Do you like children?" Clara chuckled softly, brushing a strand of hair from Emma's forehead. "Very much, especially curious ones who ask lots of questions." Emma grinned, her eyes shining. "Papa says I ask too many." "Papa doesn't mean it," Clara said gently. "Questions are how we learn. I think they make you very clever." From that day forward, Emma shadowed Clara like a small apprentice. She asked about recipes, about spices, about why bread needed time to rise, or why soup tasted better the second day. But her curiosity wasn't only about cooking. She asked about Clara's favorite flowers, her favorite color, the games she played as a child. She even asked what Clara dreamed about when she closed her eyes at night. Some questions startled Clara with their depth. "Do you ever get lonely here?" Emma whispered once, her voice so soft Clara barely heard it. Clara paused, then answered, honestly. "Sometimes, but it helps to have good company." She smiled at Emma. The girl beamed, clearly satisfied with the answer. Jacob noticed the changes too. He would return from the fields to find his daughter perched on a stool in the kitchen, peppering Clara with questions while carefully stirring a bowl of batter. For a man who had grown accustomed to his daughter's silence, it was both surprising and disarming. Though he rarely said much, Clara felt his eyes on her in those moments, watchful, measuring, almost as if he were trying to decide what it meant. That Emma had begun to bloom again under the care of the woman he had hired only to cook. For Clara, Emma's questions were no burden. Each one felt like a small key, unlocking another door in the child's heart. And as the girl's curiosity grew, so did Clara's quiet conviction. She had not only come here to cook meals, she had come, unknowingly, to feed a soul that had been hungry far too long. The evenings at Steel Ranch followed a predictable rhythm. Supper was eaten promptly at 6, the table cleared, and then Jacob often retreated to his study while Emma was sent upstairs to prepare for bed. Clara usually busied herself with the washing up, her hands steady in the warm water, though her mind often drifted toward the silence that settled once Emma disappeared. One evening, after a long day of cooking and tending to small household chores, Clara was finishing the last of the dishes when she felt a presence at her side. She turned and found Emma standing there in her nightdress, clutching a small rag doll to her chest. Her bare feet peeked out beneath the hem, her toes curling against the wooden floor. "Emma," Clara said softly, setting down the dishcloth. "Shouldn't you be upstairs in bed by now?" Emma hesitated, her eyes large and uncertain. "Papa said I should go," she admitted. "But—" She hugged the doll tighter, her voice lowering almost to a whisper. "Can you tuck me in instead?" The simple request struck Clara with unexpected force. For a moment she couldn't speak. The longing in Emma's eyes was so pure, so vulnerable, that Clara felt her heart ache in a way she hadn't known since, before Samuel passed. Kneeling so she was eye level with the child, Clara smoothed a stray lock of dark hair from Emma's face. "Do you really want me to?" she asked gently, not wanting to step where she wasn't welcome. Emma nodded quickly, her voice earnest. "You tell stories nice, and you smile like mamas do." Clara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to keep her composure. "All right then," she whispered, her lips curving into a tender smile. "Let's get you to bed." Emma's small hand slipped into hers as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Together they climbed the stairs, the old boards creaking softly under their weight. Clara followed the girl into her room, a simple space with a small bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the pastures. Clara pulled back the quilt and waited as Emma climbed into bed, the rag doll tucked securely beside her. She drew the blanket up under the girl's chin and smoothed it gently, her touch careful but full of warmth. "Would you like a story?" Clara asked. Emma's face lit up, and she nodded. "Yes, please." Clara sat on the edge of the bed and began softly, weaving a tale she remembered from her own childhood. A story of a brave little bird who built her nest high in a tree and kept it safe through storms and winds. Emma's eyes fluttered as she listened, the corners of her mouth curving into a small smile. When Clara finished, she leaned down and pressed a kiss to the child's forehead before she realized what she'd done. The gesture had come instinctively, like breathing. Emma sighed contentedly, whispering, "Good night, Miss Clara." "Good night, sweetheart," Clara replied, her voice breaking just a little as she rose. But when she turned toward the door, she froze. Jacob stood in the hallway, half shadowed by the lamplight. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable, though his eyes held something that stopped her breath. For a long moment, neither spoke. Clara lowered her gaze, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a place too intimate for her role as cook. But before she could apologize, Jacob cleared his throat softly. "She hasn't asked anyone to do that since—" He didn't finish, his voice rough with unspoken memory. Clara's hands tightened in her apron. She just needed a little comfort. "Mr. Steele." "Nothing more." Jacob studied her, his jaw tense, but there was no anger in his eyes. Only something quieter, more complicated. After a moment, he gave the smallest nod. "Thank you," he said simply, before turning away down the hall. Clara lingered at Emma's doorway, her heart still trembling from the weight of the request, and from the way Jacob had looked at her. She had come here to cook, but tonight had made one thing clear. Emma needed more than food. She needed love, and Clara, though she hadn't planned it, was giving it. For the next several nights, Clara continued her quiet routine, washing dishes, tidying the kitchen, then retiring to her small room. But things had shifted since that evening in Emma's room. The child now expected Clara's presence at bedtime, slipping downstairs each night until Clara guided her back up, tucked her in, and told her a gentle story. What began as a single tender request had quickly become a ritual. Jacob noticed. From his study, he often heard Emma's soft laughter drift, down the hall, or Clara's low voice weaving stories that lulled the girl to sleep. At first, he told himself it was harmless. Emma needed kindness, and Clara was a woman with a gentle way about her. But beneath that logic, a storm brewed in his chest. He sat at his desk late one night, papers spread before him, though his eyes refused to stay on the figures. Instead, his thoughts circled the same unease. Clara Whitfield was a widow, a stranger he'd allowed into his home because the house had needed order, and Emma had needed care. He had not asked her to fill the place of mother or wife, and yet, wasn't she doing just that? He leaned back, running a hand over his face. Since his wife's death, Jacob had built walls around himself and his daughter, tall and unyielding. They were meant to protect, to keep the ache of loss from opening wider. But Clara's presence had slipped through those walls, soft and steady as sunlight through cracks. And Jacob did not know whether to be grateful or afraid. The next morning, he found Clara in the kitchen, humming as she kneaded dough while Emma chattered at her side. It was such a simple scene, so ordinary it might have been any family kitchen. But to Jacob, it was dangerous. He stepped into the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "Emma," he said, his tone firmer than he intended, "you've chores to see to outside. Go help Tom in the barn." The girl's face fell, but she obeyed, slipping off her stool with reluctance. Clara glanced up, her brow knitting faintly at his abruptness. "She was only helping with the bread," Clara said quietly. "She's got enough to do without hanging about in the kitchen," Jacob replied, his jaw set. "I don't want her. Underfoot." Clara's hands stilled over the dough. She met his gaze, steady but not unkind. "She's a child, Mr. Steele. She needs more than chores to fill her days." His chest tightened at the calm truth in her words. For a moment he wanted to argue, to remind her of her place, that she was here as cook, not as mother. But the words caught in his throat, because deep down, he knew she was right. "She needs stability," he said instead, his voice low, clipped. "Not to get attached to someone who may not stay." Clara's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "Perhaps she needs someone who's willing to stay long enough to give her a reason to hope." The silence between them stretched, heavy as iron. Jacob's hands curled into fists at his sides. He wanted to tell her she was overstepping. Yet, in his heart, he knew the truth. Clara wasn't breaking Emma's heart. She was mending it. Later that evening, Jacob stood outside Emma's room, listening as Clara's voice drifted through the door. The girl giggled softly, her words fading into drowsy murmurs. Jacob's throat tightened. That sound, Emma's laughter, was something he had thought he might never hear again. But instead of relief, fear settled in him. He was afraid of losing it, of letting Clara weave herself into their lives only for her to vanish and tear open wounds that had just begun to heal. He turned away, his jaw set, his heart walled off, even as it betrayed him with the thought he dared not speak. What if she is exactly what Emma needs? The tension in the household lingered after Jacob's warning about attachments. Clara felt it in the way his footsteps slowed at the kitchen door, but rarely carried him inside, in the way his eyes followed her and Emma, but held a distance, like a man watching through glass. He was guarded, cautious, yet beneath it all, Clara sensed a man who wanted desperately to believe his home could be filled with warmth again. She did not press him. Instead, she chose to show her worth in the quiet, steady way she had always lived her life. Her strength was not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent acts of care, acts that slowly began to stitch their way into the fabric of the ranch. On a bright morning, Clara took Emma outside with a basket of laundry. Together, they pegged, linens to the line, the fabric snapping in the breeze like sails. Emma's laughter rang as she chased a sheet that had slipped loose, and Clara caught her, both of them collapsing into the grass in giggles. Jacob, passing by on his horse, slowed at the sight. He didn't call out, didn't linger, but his eyes softened as he rode on. Another day, when a sudden summer storm rolled in, Clara kept Emma close at the window. The child trembled at the crash of thunder, her fingers tight around her doll. Clara wrapped an arm around her shoulders and began humming softly, the same lullaby she had once sung to calm her own fears as a girl. Slowly, Emma's trembling eased, her head leaning against Clara's side. Jacob, standing unnoticed in the hallway, watched the scene with something unreadable in his gaze. Clara's strength also showed in her quiet respect for Jacob. She never overstepped, never tried to replace his authority. When Emma questioned why she had to help with barn chores, Clara didn't contradict him. Instead, she walked Emma out to the barn herself, tying a kerchief around the child's head and showing her how to sweep the floor in playful strokes. By the time Jacob appeared, Emma was working diligently, her little chin lifted proudly. Clara simply smiled and returned to her kitchen, leaving Jacob to recognize that she was teaching Emma not to avoid responsibility, but to embrace it with joy. One evening, when supper was late because a sick calf had kept Jacob in the fields longer than expected, Clara waited. She kept the stew warm, the bread covered, and the table set as though supper were not a chore but a welcome home ritual. When Jacob finally entered, weary and mud-streaked, she met him not with complaint, but with a plate and a kind word. "You should eat before you rest," she said, placing the bowl before him. "Work goes easier on a full stomach." Jacob sat heavily, glancing at her with something almost like gratitude. He ate in silence, but she noticed how his shoulders eased as the warmth of the meal seeped through him. Emma climbed into the chair, beside him chattering about her day, and Jacob listened, nodding faintly as his daughter spoke. For the first time in a long while, supper didn't feel like a duty. It felt like a family gathering. That night, as Clara tucked Emma into bed, the little girl whispered, "You make everything better, Miss Clara. Even Papa smiles more now." Clara brushed the child's hair from her forehead, her heart tugging at the words. "I'm glad, sweetheart. Smiles are important in a home." Downstairs, Jacob sat alone in his study, the echo of his daughter's laughter still lingering in the walls. He could not deny what Clara had brought into the house: steadiness, warmth, and a kind of gentle strength that did not demand, but simply was. And though he told himself to remain cautious, Jacob Steele could not help but feel that his walls, brick by brick, were beginning to give way. Jacob Steele was a man who had spent years mastering the art of distance. Since his wife's passing, he had carried grief like armor, convincing himself that the safest way to protect Emma, and himself, was to keep others at arm's length. People left, storms came, cattle died, and life went on. That was the creed he lived by. Don't lean too heavily on anyone, and you'll never break when they're gone. But Clara Whitfield was undoing all of that, piece by piece, without even trying. It started in small ways. Jacob noticed her hands, steady and sure, guiding Emma as she learned to braid her hair in the mornings. He noticed her laugh, low and unforced, spilling into the halls and drawing Emma out of silence. He noticed the order she brought to his household, not with the harshness of rules, but with the gentleness of someone who understood what a home needed to feel alive. One evening, after a long day of branding cattle, Jacob came in late, his back aching and dust clinging to his clothes. He expected the house to be dark, supper long cleared away. Instead, he found Clara in the kitchen, a lamp glowing on the table, a plate waiting under a cloth. "You shouldn't have waited up," he muttered. "Surprised." "I wasn't waiting," she said simply, though the warmth in her eyes gave her away. "I just thought you might like a hot meal before bed." He sat heavily, And for the first time in years, he found himself talking, just a little, about the work, about the cattle, about how the weather might turn. Clara listened, her chin resting lightly on her hand, her eyes never straying from his. There was no judgment, no impatience, just quiet understanding. It unsettled him more than silence ever had. A few days later, Jacob returned from town to find Emma and Clara in the garden, kneeling in the dirt as they coaxed life from rows of struggling vegetables. Emma's laughter rang across the yard as Clara showed her how to mound soil around the roots. Jacob stood at a distance, watching them, and felt something stir inside him, a longing he hadn't allowed himself in years. That night, Emma came to him with shining eyes. "Papa, Miss Clara says I'm good at growing things. She says we'll have flowers by the porch by summer." Jacob smiled faintly, brushing a hand over his daughter's hair. "That so?" "Yes," Emma said firmly. "She makes everything grow, Papa. Even smiles." Jacob had no answer for that. He only kissed her forehead and sent her to bed, but the words lodged deep in his heart. The walls he had built, meant to shield him from pain, were beginning to crack. He caught himself looking for Clara in the kitchen, listening for her hum in the mornings, noticing the way her presence eased the sharp edges of his days. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and violet, Jacob found Clara on the porch, shelling beans with Emma at her side. He leaned against the post, arms crossed, watching the simple scene. "You've changed this place," he said at last, his voice low, almost reluctant. Clara looked up, startled by the honesty in his tone. "I only cook meals and keep things tidy, Mr. Steele." He shook his head, his gaze steady on her. "It's more than that. Emma, she's laughing again, talking. She hasn't done that in years." Clara's eyes softened, and for a moment, their gazes held. She wanted to tell him that it wasn't just Emma who was changing, but him too. Instead, she only said, "Sometimes it just takes a little warmth to bring life back." Jacob didn't reply, but he didn't need to. In the quiet of that evening, with the sound of Emma's soft humming beside Clara, he realized the truth. The walls he had built were no match for the gentle strength of the woman sitting before him. And for the first time in years, he let the thought cross his heart. Maybe, just maybe, it was safe to hope again. The summer sun stretched longer across the plains, casting golden light over the Steele ranch. The house, once silent and echoing with loneliness, now pulsed with a quiet warmth. It wasn't just the smell of Clara's fresh bread or the sound of Emma's laughter. It was something deeper, something alive that had been missing for years. Clara had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, not by force, but by presence. She tended to her kitchen, guided Emma with patience, and steadied Jacob's restless household without ever demanding recognition. Yet, slowly, Jacob realized her influence was woven into every corner of his life. One evening, after a long day, in the fields, Jacob returned to find Emma on the porch, proudly showing Clara a wildflower crown she had made. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes. "Papa," she said, tugging his hand, "look what Miss Clara taught me. She says every home needs flowers to feel alive." Jacob's throat tightened as he looked between the crown of daisies and the woman smiling gently at his daughter. Once, the ranch had been nothing but hard work and duty. Now, with Clara's touch, it was beginning to feel like a home again. That night, after Emma had been tucked into bed, Jacob lingered in the kitchen doorway. Clara was wiping down the table, her hair loose, a soft tiredness in her movements. "You do more than you know," he said quietly. She glanced up, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. "I only do what I can." Jacob stepped further into the room, his voice low, steady but hesitant. "Emma's different now, happier, stronger. I thought, I thought she'd never laugh like that again, but she does, because of you." Clara's eyes softened, but she shook her head gently. Emma already had it in her. She just needed someone to remind her it was still there. He studied her, the silence stretching between them. For years he had built walls so high, even, he couldn't see over them. But with Clara, those walls had crumbled without warning, and he found himself facing the truth. He didn't want to imagine the ranch without her anymore. The following Sunday, Jacob saddled the wagon and insisted Clara and Emma join him for a drive to town. At first, Clara hesitated, unsure if it was proper. But Emma's pleading eyes left her no choice. Together, they rode into town, Clara seated beside Jacob, Emma nestled happily between them. It wasn't lost on the townsfolk who paused to stare. Jacob Steele, the wealthy rancher known for his solitude, was no longer alone. Whispers stirred, but Jacob didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt pride, not in his wealth or his land, but in the company he kept beside him. Back at the ranch that evening, as the sky burned pink with sunset, Emma clung to Clara's hand. "Miss Clara, will you stay forever? Not just to cook, but to be here, with me, with Papa." The words, spoken with such innocent hope, silenced them both. Jacob's heart clenched. He met Clara's gaze across the child's head, and for a moment neither spoke. But something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had already begun to grow. Clara knelt, brushing a stray curl from Emma's cheek. "Sweetheart, I'll stay as long as I'm welcome. I promise you." "That," Jacob's chest swelled at the words. He stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly over Emma's hair, his eyes locked on Clara's. "You'll always be welcome here," he said, his voice low, resolute. In that moment, something shifted. The ranch was no longer a place of loss and silence. It was a place of laughter, warmth, and hope. Clara had not only filled their bellies, but had filled the hollow spaces in their hearts. And as the evening shadows stretched long across the land, Jacob Steele knew he was no longer guarding ruins. He was building something new, a family, a new beginning.